Good morning. We're gathering our gang in the playground, and it's time to act. There was a time in this country when a guy could get a job, a blue collar job, a job that produced things, such as a repairman, and his income would be more than enough to provide for a wife and 2.2 children, and they could live in a detached house. And that's called home economics, and that's what made this country such a great place to live, the United States. And they changed all that, and the profound change came in the 1970s. And ever since then, they pushed us into a consumption society, and ever since then, it's beginning worse and worse. And now we're in dire straits. So we're trying to gather up our single mom, the gal that has a little child to support, who looks at him for everything, at her. And she's working all day, and her child is at a daycare if she can even afford it. And there's money for rent and money for food and clothing. And the idea of recreational time has long but since gone out the window. The guy could work about 40 hours a week, and then he had to start working more and more hours. And then him and his wife had to start working in order to pay the gas bill. And now they have to work far more than 80 hours, 40 hours a week for both of them, just to try and come up with enough money. And that's if they still have a guy and a gal living together, and it just doesn't work out. And so we're gathering our gang. Along with that is the guy. It's so common now for a little toddler to look up to a guy who is not his biological father, and he starts to attach to him the idea of being a dad. And if that's you, and you're driving a forklift in a warehouse, you better start speaking up. If you're going to be a father and you're going to support these guys, you're going to make enough money to support these guys. That home economics is the opposite of individual rights, and they're just two completely different things. We now live in a peasant and property class world, and you got to start standing up to this stuff. We'll talk about this and that. We have and reparations are going to go in your direction in a big hurry. Just so it said, we have about 3 dozen small anecdotes on our 2 YouTube channels. The Priest and the Pimp is one of them, and the Priest and the Pimp Media Access. We're trying to rearrange that so it's a little easier to get to. So here we're just going to ramble in the good sense of the word. We know exactly what's wrong. We know exactly what to do about it. We know how to do it. It's a question of doing it. What's wrong is that they threw out God and country. They threw out those 3 things that make up God and country in a shop manual fashion. Straightening up our emotions, willing the good of another person, and doing it because Christ rose on the 3rd day. Before we start repeating ourselves about that, let's go back. If you're a gal and you have a toddler, well, how much money do you make? Are you working? You're supposed to have a job. Being a home economist, being a mother in this camp is considered a fundamental profession. First, you're a person, you're a Susie in St. Louis, and what makes you a citizen is you decided to straighten yourself up emotionally and sort of get into the character of being a normal and well-adjusted person. It's not a natural thing, and that's what God and country comes into it. And you take on the profession of being a mother. And if you're going to take on the profession of being a mother, then you get to live in a house. And quite frankly, the gal who changes the dirty diapers gets the sex. And all the biological stuff is your department. And you place that inside the romantic stuff. And at the top of that romantic stuff is a Catholic nun. This all comes out of popes and monks and monasteries. Say Catholic shit. If you didn't know it, you're a philosophical fancy pants. Now you've got to listen to this or find people who do, and you've got to start calling in. I make this much money. This is how much bills these are my bills, and this is how much money I have for recreation, which I don't think exists anymore. Or you could be in the upper class, and just to get things out. Remember, at the time our society cashed in on everything, there was a soldered connection between money and malice. You couldn't cash in on it all and not be a scoundrel, and it's just the way it was. And Republican and Democrat or conservative or liberal just really came in second. You got into all, you throughout God, you separated the act of sex from the act of getting the gal pregnant, and you started making money by causing people to have to work more hours. In the Bible, that's called one of the unforgivable sins. They couldn't care less. They, that's your religion, not theirs, and they went ahead and did it. They became the upper class in a peasant and property class society. Today, it's a little different. You could be a young girl and be in the upper class, and you could be a scoundrel, a very decent person. It's just the way it is now. There's a different set of rules. And you can be in the lower class, and you could be a very decent person or a scoundrel, and that's the way it is. Here, we're going to take a step back. We're going to rearrange things back along the lines of the classic battle of good and evil. The priest, he's a good guy, and he says, say what you mean what you say, everything else comes from the evil one. Then there's a line across in our fancy graph as a priest, and then there's a line, there's a flip-flop. And then you go out in the other direction, and over here is a pimp. And the pimp knows how to hustle, con, manipulate, and intimidate people. In this camp, he's called the bad guy. In their camp, he's either one of two people. He's either the normal taken into the abnormal, the chimpanzee side of us taken out, and he's just a psychopathic nut, or he does it intentionally. He intentionally knows how to manipulate people. Very similar to American slavery, where they lived in the big house and everybody lived in the slave quarters. And they couldn't, we call them evil. They call themselves a class of intelligentsia. They could also call themselves slumlords. The communists and fascists, in the end, become the same person. And they're just two different ways of describing things. We give them a very negative thing. They give themselves a very positive thing. But the actualization of it all is that they live in the foothills, and you and I live as a class of peasantry. We live side by side with the gals who are supposed to jump for joy because they put their kids in a daycare center and head off to work at the factory. And it just doesn't work that way. You know it's not true because those gals in the 70s or the 80s, the gals who are now head of the university departments and the huge government departments in our society, they could have very easily, in a dozen different ways, said something like, we're women and we're going to enter the workplace, but since our husbands are already there, we're only going to get 50, we'll get paid 50%, and our husbands will get paid 50%. Or they could have gone out and did things just for the joy of it, or they could have done lots of things that way, but they didn't do it. Quite frankly, to get things out, it happened something like this. Hubby made enough money to support a wife and kids, and he paid the gas bill and the electric bill and the mortgage, or the paycheck did. Keeping in mind that the word job has more than one meaning for us. And the gal entered the workplace, but the bum's rush is that she didn't enter the workplace. She went out and got a job, but it was still part of the consumption budget. That is, she didn't have to pay for the gas and electric bill for that decade or two or three that society changed. And they also had an attitude about it. So what did they do? They went and got into a duplex, and they got people to rent property, so they rent their property so that they could, those people renting could pay their mortgage. And that was it. That was the peasant and property class society. They did that over and over and over again. You must commit acts of a reverse discrimination and favor people who are malicious. The tennis is an example of that. But for right now, they could have been a guy and a gal, and they were quite, or a black guy or a Mexican guy, and they were quite, they thought of each other. They were just they just were all malicious. So if I take a step back and I arrange things along the battle of good and evil, they were just evil. They just cashed in on it all. They discriminated against people who tried to practice virtues. The women's liberation movement didn't discriminate for or against women. They discriminated in favor of women who are malicious and against women who practice virtues. And women usually have a kid. You talk about a child. And so the gal who went back and asked the 10-year-old what he wanted for his birthday, they were plunged into poverty. They're the ones that live in housing projects. They're the ones that live in slumlords, in slums. And that has to change. Here, that's considered a very bad thing. If you go ask the university professors, they think it's just grand. And you realize that these people aren't all there emotionally. They're just like all the other countries now. There's no talking to them. They think it's perfectly okay if you're a peasant or a peon. And they won't exactly listen. Let me remind myself what home economics is. Oh, excuse me. In the 1950s, the communists said they'd come out in the United States. They would overthrow the United States by about the year 1973. And that the year 1973 happened to be the year of the highest standard of living when it comes to the average Joe in the United States. The standard of living went up and up and up. And we were in seventh heaven. This house you're looking at behind me, this is a house I grew up in. Our parents bought it right around 1950. And he was a repairman. And with that repairman salary, he bought a 3-bedroom brick house and a half-acre lot. This neighborhood was built then. And if you could go 2 doors down, and there was a milkman, and there was a plumber, and a school teacher, and a guy who worked in a feed store, and a photographer. And the idea was, and the people who built the house lived in the house. The people who did the producing did the consuming. The guy who built the neighborhood, his son was Deacon Cheney. He was a famous senator for decades here. And you could just see the idea of taking your hand and pushing away. This house was built by one person, by the way. And there was a guy who built another house. He built, and they both had mid-century modern architecture, but they were so different. And you could see them building a house for the people who bought it. It just goes on and on that way, and lots of good things happened. Let me get back to our story. In the 1970s is when it all changed. And in philosophy, they threw out God. They had the sexual revolution, and they institutionalized malice. And they started making money by forcing other people to have to work more hours. In other words, they threw out, I think it's the fourth and fifth way of Aquinas, if we want to get philosophical, their arguments of perfection and that sort of thing. They're more affectionately known as the truth of the truth and the decent of the decent. In other words, the gal who changes the dirty diapers gets the sex. The priest who takes a vow of poverty maximizes profits. And they go together like two segments of a line. And it's that Christ coming back on the third day that's held as faith. And the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and Mass is sort of, there's an infusion there. And it's very famous stuff that they never taught us when I went to the U of A here. That infusion is something you have to have. You call that faith. And then you become a normal, well-adjusted person. And that's what makes you a citizen of the United States. It's race relegated to an endearing quality of your parents. A man is a man and a woman is a woman. And then you're a good husband if you want to take on the family as a profession, then a good father, and then a good wife and motherhood. And it turns into home economics. Home economics, go back to the detached house here. That was as opposed to communist housing projects and slumlord and apartments in most of the other countries in the world, in the communist countries, and in fact, most of the history of human beings in this world. It was very rare to do what the United States did. We'll go back to our 1950s house, detached house that was intentionally designed to live in. It had a bedroom, a living room that was comfortable, and a bedroom and a dining room to eat in, and a kitchen to support the dining room, and a backyard for yourself and the kids, and a garage. And the car was viewed as much as a farm truck. It was a car that serviced the household. Home economics is actually the opposite of poverty. There's poverty, and then there's bringing people out of poverty into plenty. Home economics is what does that. And a house has to be designed a certain way. An architect told me once that you could design a house, he could design a house where the couple would get divorced in 6 months, or he could design a house where people would live happily ever after. And the houses these days aren't built along the lines of home economics. So go back here. There's home economics, there's our house, there's a couple living inside it. And you go off to the side, and in a daydreamy fashion, there's farming and mining. Then above that, manufacturing. Then above that, wholesale, retail, and repair. And above that, retirement, education, and recreation. And the doctors and lawyers form a kind of lattice that holds it all together. And it's a Catholic priest that causes it all to come into being to begin with. That's the religious part that causes all this to come into being. Home economics is a Catholic shtick. So are courts. Courts came out in 1973, so right around then, and they said, we decided that there would be no religion in government. And in doing so, they automatically threw out those three things that make up God and country, which includes being normal and well-adjusted, and it includes a normal supply and demand curve, and it includes this huge middle class that we had. Without sounding odd, those courts, when they came out and said that, took the very stereotypical definition of a satanic church. So what the satanic is defined as the complete absence of Catholicism, of those three things in our shop manual fashion that make up God and country. And the shop manual, what it all amounts to is that they institutionalize hustling. They institutionalize a sexual revolution. They institutionalize malice, perfectly okay. And they institutionalize the idea of making money by causing people to have to work more hours. In this camp, that's called treason. It isn't even called illegal. There are curbs on the road over here, and they jump the curb. And so if you're a young gal and you have children and they're counting on you and you just don't know what to do, you can't stay up all night and work all day and watch somebody else raise your child. That's a consequence of all this. When it comes to reparations, now we have an honest sense of reparations. So we have an idea of what home economics is, and we know that this all started in the early 1970s. There was a profound change in our society then. And if you look, quite frankly, they didn't roll in with tanks, but they did throw bombs in the streets. You give us everything we ask for, we're going to tear it all down, says Donna Shalala, the first Black female Surgeon General. And for the violent overthrow of the United States government, replacing it with communism, says Angela Davis, who was a violent communist activist. She's a university professor. And when they had the riots here a few years ago, there she is. She's still around, putting her fist in the air and getting everybody, black guys, to, she's a black gal, getting black guys to go out and take to the streets and start fires in the streets. And she's still putting her fist in the air. And if I got the story right, she was getting $30,000 a speech for it as well. You remember, these guys got everything they asked for. When it comes to things like Black Lives Matter, to drift a bit, they got everything. You keep your mouth shut and give us everything they want, and you had to. You give us everything we want, and if you have to go in debt, that's fine, and it's perfectly okay, because after all the United States has to do is pay the interest on that debt, and the United States is so large, you can theoretically carry that interest on forever. So you give us everything we want, and they did. And take a look. The leaders of the Black Civil Rights Movement, they just pigged out. They had all the sex and drugs and money. They made millions off it. You better take a look at those guys. What happened to the people, the black guys? Well, they ended up in places like communist housing projects, and they don't stand a chance. There's no fathers. The mothers are in dire straits. Kids are living in what amounts to the most expensive ghettos in the history of human beings on this earth. There's absolutely no excuse. It's all done by black guys. It was all done by that black leadership. In fact, you could attend classes on how to adopt your black culture, and they insisted that that was the way it was going to be. They're not the only ones. There's a whole group of white guys in faded tie-dye shirts and peppermint rainbow albums living on the sidewalk in San Francisco. And there's all the rock and rollers who are as hedonistic as could possibly be. And John Lennon was one of the pillars of that. And he was living in a Manhattan apartment, singing songs about the glories of communism. And they put a camera on him while he philosophically fooled around with his wife, Yoko Ono, in a Manhattan apartment as soon as they changed the sheets for social justice. And it's a joke. And they did it, and it worked. Let's go back to the 50s. In Quartz was the profound change. When they came out and said that there would be no religion in government, that was the sneaking it in department, the Twilight Zone hustle that caused everything to change. They said they would in the 1950s, and they did it, and they just sort of snuck it in. And in philosophy, they threw out God and country, the very thing that made this country such a magical place to live, and that's treason. So when you see courts these days, you have every right to stand up to them and say, that's enough of you. Don't open your mouth. You keep your mouth shut. We have to change things. To get something else out about the courts, this little anecdote helps me. Judges wear black robes because Catholic priests 500 years ago in England wore black robes. All comes out of them. And so that's why they're called a judicial court. A judicial court is a court that will establish facts that are true as true. And they're as opposed to a sophistical court. Sophistical means to establish facts that aren't true as true. And it'll all reduce to a kind of a sense of original sin. You close your eyes, you fantasize about the gals, you become sexually aroused. You do it again, only this time in your mind, you're actually getting the gal pregnant. And now I understand what original sin is with the snap of a finger. And when they threw that out and started hurting other people, making money by making everybody work more hours, well, that was it. They threw out a judicial court. Let's see it. Let's see a film of an abortion. You have to watch the film Abortion because there's two very different meanings. One is the stereotypical gal who's in trouble, and she should never have to be in trouble if she's pregnant. She should be jumping for joy. And there's that world where you're beside yourself, you don't know what to do. Then there's the world of the women's liberation movement. Instead of standing up for the gal and standing up for the guy who takes care of the gal, instead of standing up for the couple, and that's called the normal supply and demand curve, they went the other way. They had 3 or 4 abortions, and then they had their child, and you had to do everything for them. You had to commit acts of reverse discrimination. And you realize these guys have absolutely no sense of love in them. They have no sense of empathy. They're the very definitions of what a psychopath is. And they're also consider themselves an intellectual. And they're also the ones running the university departments and the departments in government. Forgive me, but Hillary Clinton is an absolutely terrific example of me, for me, as somebody who has absolutely no sense of love in them or no sense of guilt in them. And that's as it's true with the Black civil rights gals and the other leaders of the feminist movement. And quite frankly, you can throw in there the leaders of the guys, Black civil rights guys, and you can throw in the leaders of the intellectuals, the white intellectuals, and the Mexican guys. I'll remind you that the Mexican had a revolution in the 1920s, and it was a communist revolution. They beat the daylights out of the Catholics, and they won. And there's a stereotypical peasant and property class society. There's a small group of people who rule everything. There's a huge gap and a huge group of peasantry. And it's very stereotypical of the intellectual government. It makes sense. That's just what you do if there is no world after you die. Well, let's go back to you. We're going to be a normal, well-adjusted gal, just typical. You feel as if you're trying to make the grade. Oh, excuse me, I left something out. When it comes to abortion, let's see a film of an abortion. When it comes to let's associate that abortion, the kind of abortion that Hillary Clinton or Maxine Waters or Nancy Pelosi or those gals on TV that you see. Let's see that kind of an abortion. Let's see a film of a partial birth abortion. If it's true that that aborted fetus is a human being, then yes, they threw out a judicial court, and they they committed genocide. You don't talk to those judges. Quite frankly, they're doctors, and doctors know that when Mr. Semen comes together with the little egg in the ovary, that little kid's there, and that's it. It's not open for discussion. And so they threw out a judicial court, and they're very nasty about it. And it's up to you to turn around and say, nope, sorry, that's not right. It's not even close to being right. One of us is committing treason, and it's not this camp. A word of warning: to be normal and well-adjusted is to go against your gut. And the first thing you have to deal with is that emotion. You have this desire to turn around and attack everybody. And the truth of the matter is, it's just going against the chimpanzee side of us. And you feel as if you're making the grade, and you are in a way. And along with that is the idea that you're not going to come close to being perfect. If the shop manual definition of mental illness is the normal taken into the abnormal, from a cold to the flu to pneumonia, you go back from pneumonia to the cold to the back to being normal, and then normal isn't normal at all. And so it's like a sack you put right side in. And it's not a natural thing. And not only is it not a natural thing, it's a conflicting thing. And you're only going to bat about 300. A professional baseball player, at the very best, may only bat 300. In other words, he might get a hit 3 times out of 10, and the rest of the time, he's just not going to get a hit. And you just have to laugh and have fun with that. You let your hair down on the weekends and that sort of thing. And if you're going to be the gal who changes the dirty diapers and are normal, well-adjusted, and you have this sense of caring about you, well, you get the fun stuff, as they say. And that's a value judgment. It's just a choice. Taking that caring stuff, which is just an attitude and a chemistry inside your head, and the electrons inside the atoms inside your head, and holding that as something terribly important, is the religious side of things. It's the Catholic side of things. You can go on the computer and take a look at the vocational stories of Catholic nuns, and you'll see and compare them with the women's liberation movement, and they're just two different worlds. You can see things in a very obvious fashion. It's hard to put an emotion into words. You could see it there. Courts are the same way. If I had my way, this, by the way, is Aristotle. They're making a big deal about Aristotle and that sort of thing. This is Aristotle and Plato, and this is the Catholic stuff. And the person you're listening to made a big deal about trying to stand up to hustlers and having to get a stereotypical do-gooder degree, and then going back and trying to figure out, reverse engineer everything. Spend an awful lot of time doing that, and they did that to us on purpose. We better start to sum up here. So, excuse me. When we have the story of the priest or the pimp, that is Aristotle. That is what this country was founded on. That George Washington wasn't officially Catholic, but they were officially a bunch of Yanks. And if you can't be a bunch of Yanks without being Catholic, well, you're officially Catholic, and then a bunch of Yanks come into being. And that's it. I quit feeling sorry for myself that way. I drifted a bit, but if you're a gal and you feel as if you're trying to make the grade, well, you are. And you don't worry about it. You just place an importance on yourself. And then you start calling in here. We need to know how much money you make, and we need to know what the money goes for. And we'll compare that with a household budget. We need to know how much a household budget today is. If you were going to live like a 1950s professional housewife, a professional citizen, how much of and run the household along the lines of as if you were run a business is similar to the way of describing it. How much of a budget do you need? And if you're a guy, you really don't ask how much money you make. You ask instead, how many hours do I have to work in order to come up with this? I'll guarantee you it's more than 40. Quite frankly, I'll guarantee you it's more than 80. I'll guarantee you it's double that for the average person. That's how far we've come. And we come to the point we're going to collapse. If you speak up, we can do something about it. If you speak up, then we know exactly what's wrong. They said they would throw out our society, and they did. We know exactly what to do about it. Instead of courts saying there is no God, you go to town and replace the judges with judges that say that there is only God and country. You replace it with the Apostles' Creed. Those judges in the Supreme Court that have lifetime jobs, well, they can also take a vow of celibacy and poverty, and they can become canon law. And that would be the literal opposite of the way it is now. And I'm sure those judges won't mind. I'm sure those judges will stand down, get a garbage sack, and go around Washington, D.C. and form a class of peasantry beneath a class of poverty that they caused. I don't believe a word I just said, but I'm sure they'll do that, right? And then you replace them with canon law lawyers or with Catholic priests. And then they form the curbs on the road. And then I pretend there's somebody walking down the steps of the Supreme Court, and the world changes. Now, if you want to be a citizen of the United States, we're a melting pot of people. It's race relegated to an endearing quality of appearance, and a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and we turn it back into home economics. We'll replace these international monetary funds when we'll place them inside the auspices of the United States. And there's a bunch of household units, and we know exactly what to do. There's a young couple in that household unit. We go off to the side, and we ask them what they want. And all of society, all of the manufacturing, all of the marketing, everything's geared towards getting that couple what they want. That couple is you. So if you're listening to this, please go spread the word. I have to laugh. We have Time to Act, which is a Facebook group, and Time to Act, which is on Instagram, and we're working to spread we have a YouTube channel. We've had it on for a few years now. One of these days, someone's actually going to look at the darn thing. And it'll all come down to you, just like every other society. If you stand up for it, then you can do something about it. And so, excuse me. This is Sunday, and we try to come on Sunday at 8 o'clock Los Angeles time, 11 New York, and about 4 Great Britain time. And on Saturdays and Mondays, about 7 in the evening in Great Britain, and noon here in Tucson, where this is being filmed, and 11 on the West Coast. And I have to watch it, though, because like everybody else right now, I do a great deal of babysitting. I don't mind babysitting a bit. So, I certainly mind the reasons for it. There's people, there's myself and lots of other people trying to provide stability for the youngsters. And one gal, she just can't make enough money to send the kid to daycare. What's she doing to begin with? You're supposed to come across with the family budget and let her raise her own kid. She's very responsible and very much a professional yank. You just come across to the family budget and get out of her life, and she becomes the deciding person that decides our society. You always have to add something in. I should close this now, but I get to add something that has to do with the person you're listening with my youth. We were in elementary school, and one of my good friends um, lived across down the road a bit, and we would come home from elementary school, and he would practice his violin. And when he was done, I would go over there, and I would enter through the secret man from Uncle Headquarters entry, and we would play. And he was a real smart guy because he was left-handed, and it was a stereotypical right out of Leave It to Beaver world. The problem with that guy is his aunt had threw him in a car and tried to get him out of the housing projects in on the East Coast. One of the ones that's on the news so much, and she brought him out here to Tucson, and she tried like mad to get a job. I think she was a janitor at the hospital a few miles down the road. What I saw of her when I could see her, she looked, walked, talked, and acted just like a stereotypical 1950s housewife. They were a black guy. It's a black guy and a black gal. And I should say a 19 stereotypical white American housewife. And she just couldn't do it. That's as opposed to the black civil rights gals you see running around. She couldn't do it. She couldn't make ends meet. So they had to move back to the housing projects on the east side, on the East Coast. You know darn well what happened to him. He didn't last. His attitude changed, and he joined a gang, and he just, you know darn well what happened to him. Never stood a chance. And it's strictly the environment. It had to do with black culture, but it didn't have to do with the color of his skin. They just couldn't do it. They just couldn't come across with the family budget, get out of her life. Dad in class, they'd show up with another kid, and life would have been good. And they couldn't do it. Now, picture the leaders of the civil rights movement, the Jesse Jackson and those guys, and picture what the world would have been like if people had stood up to him, got him out of there, and went on about our lives. Yeah, well, that gal, if there's going to be reparations, you're going to make reparations to the American housewife, and you're going to make reparations to the guy who's staring at some little boy who's looking up at him and saying, calling him daddy, and well, he's a dad now, and if he is, boy, he's going to get a house, he's going to get a mortgage, and he's going to get a job that pays more than enough to pay for the budget, and he's going to get a recreational time. He can go out and play in that silly tennis tournament they have every year. I insist on it, and I insist on it at the point of a gun. It's an unnatural thing. It's what I fight for. Let me add the lawyers. I told you I put a lot of effort into this, and decades ago, when society was cashing in on everything, there were lawyers, and they have a totem pole. At the bottom of the totem pole was the Perry Mason lawyers, the criminal trial attorneys, and the prosecutors, and they were considered naive and not very bright. At the other end were the real estate attorneys and tax attorneys and stockbroking attorneys, and they made about 3.5 times as much money. And you sort of play, you call it my undercover cop. You just sort of stare at them and try and figure out what's going on. And so you ask an obvious question with my do-gooder degrees. What makes them stupid, or naive is a better word. And what made them naive was the disposition of defending the poor and the oppressed. And that's a very real thing. That was considered naive and not very bright. At the other end, the guys that were building all the property, they were renting out to other people and cashing in on society. They had no sense of love in them. They had no sense of empathy. They couldn't care less about making somebody else work more hours. They would literally feel good hurting other people. It's a famous philosophical phrase. And it's hard to put the lack of emotion into words, and that's who they were. And so the idea here, they did change our society, and they did have a revolution, and you're not getting out of facing these guys. And so what you would do here, you end up with a 4-step process. And one of the things you do is take a step back and grab your 3-cornered hat. If you can't turn to the cop, you turn to the lawyers. Can't turn to the lawyers, you turn to the courts. If the courts screw up, well, then you take a step back, you grab your 3-cornered hat, you do just what this country says you're supposed to do, it's actually in the books. You go downtown, throw the judges out of there, and instead of taking over the place and giving yourself a Cuban cigar and that sort of thing, you find the poor slob of a criminal trial attorney that defends the poor and the oppressed, and you insist he lives in a doctor's and lawyer's house, and you insist he takes Wednesdays off, and you insist he plays in that silly tennis tournament. I have the good kind of dependent personality. We're all Yanks here. If this guy goes all the way through law school and he's overly bright and overly conscious, he gets to go play tennis and he gets to be the judges and that sort of thing. Once you got Perry Mason back in there, it becomes, that's phase one. Phase two, you go between Tucson and Tombstone and set the ladder straight. We have our own version of reparations. And then phase three, you picture a 1950s American house and do what we said. You start off with farming and mining and that sort of thing, and you Darwinize the heaven. You ask the couple what they want, and we start planting crops and building factories that are based around home economics. And so let's stop there. Let's end it there. And if you are listening to this, I hope you are, please tune in. Or if you hear it, you go on the YouTube channel or Facebook or Instagram, and you start complaining. We start gathering our gang. If you're a young man, you're just going to have to stand up to everybody above you. If you're a union guy, you have to stand up to unions and that sort of thing. And once you do that, then we can do something about it. You better do something about it. Well, we hope to see you. We'll see you tomorrow, hopefully, which is Monday around 12 o'clock. Thank you. Goodbye.